The wind cut through the dusty town square of Riverbend, Dakota Territory, carrying with it the bitter sting of winter. Mariah stood alone on the platform, clutching her small, weathered suitcase as the stagecoach that had carried her across miles of barren frontier rattled away into the distance. She had arrived at the end of her journey, but instead of finding the safety she had hoped for, she was left with nothing but the cold, unforgiving landscape and the realization that she had been abandoned. She'd come west to escape a life of hardship, to find work and a fresh start. The letter she had received from the merchant Samuel Hull had promised her a future, a partnership, a home, a place where she could finally build something. But the promises written in ink had melted away with the arrival of a hard truth. Samuel wasn't the man he had portrayed himself to be. The freight wagon driver helped her down, offering only a grunt of acknowledgement as she stepped into the snow. Her breath misted in the air, her thin shawl barely offering any protection against the chill. She tried to smile, despite the tightness in her chest, but the tears that threatened to fall were quickly wiped away by the wind. There was no sign of Samuel, no welcoming face in the crowd, only the unblinking eyes of townsfolk who watched with silent curiosity, judging her as she stood there, alone with her bag and the small bundle in her arms. A half-hour passed before a man appeared across the square, his broad shoulders draped in a wool coat, his hat pulled low against the wind. He moved with a quiet, steady confidence, and as he drew closer, Mariah noticed something about him, an air of calm that seemed out of place in this harsh land. His boots crunched through the snow, and his gaze settled on her, taking in the sight of her weary face and the bundle of blankets clutched tightly in her arms. Mariah stiffened. She wasn't sure whether to run or stay, but the man did not seem like the kind who would hurt her. He stopped just in front of her, his dark eyes studying her with something like curiosity. "Lost something?" His voice was deep, roughened by the long hours of riding. Mariah swallowed the lump in her throat. She nodded, her hands trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. I thought I was supposed to meet a man here, Samuel Hull. I have no place to go." The cowboy's expression hardened slightly at the mention of Samuel's name. "Oh, huh?" He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the square as if expecting someone to appear. "I don't know much about Samuel Hull, but I do know that a woman and 2 babies don't fit into his plans. No man like that would ever want the trouble." She felt a pang of something sharp. Was it shame, or was it something worse, like the final wound to the heart? His gaze softened. "You've got 2 choices, ma'am," he said, his voice steady but not unkind. "You can stay out here in the cold and wait for a man who's never going to come, or you can come with me." Mariah blinked, confusion furrowing her brow. "What do you mean?" He tilted his head slightly. "I'm taking you to the boarding house. No questions asked. You're coming with me, and we'll figure out the rest later." She hesitated. Her pride screamed at her to refuse, to turn away, walk back to the station, and try to make sense of the mess she had gotten herself into. But she knew there was no going back. The journey had already cost her too much. And with nothing left to lose, she had no choice but to take the risk. "I'll go," she said, her voice a mixture of fear and determination. The cowboy's eyes softened, just a fraction. He nodded and, without a word, turned and began to walk in the direction of the boarding house. Mariah followed, her boots crunching softly in the snow as the wind howled around them, but she felt the warmth of his presence beside her, steady and unyielding. Behind them, the town square slowly emptied as the last few townsfolk returned to their homes, but Mariah barely noticed. She had nothing left but the man ahead of her, the only person who seemed willing to offer her even the faintest glimmer of hope. It was a hope she wasn't sure she could trust, but in a world so cruel and uncertain, it was all she had. The journey to the boarding house was quiet, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the snow, the cold air sharp in Mariah's lungs. She tried to focus on the rhythm of walking, to steady her nerves, but every step was weighted with the unspoken fear of the unknown. The cowboy, whose name she still didn't know, walked beside her without hurry, his pace steady. His presence was reassuring, though she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper in his silence, something he wasn't saying. The buildings they passed were small, wooden structures, their windows dark against the early evening. Mariah felt the eyes of the few residents still out on the streets on her, their gazes sharp and curious. It didn't take long for her to realize that she was a stranger here, an outsider in a place where everyone seemed to know each other, where everyone had a place but her. The cowboy turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he noticed her glancing at the people. "Don't mind them," he said, his voice low. "They'll stare, but they'll forget you soon enough." Quote. She nodded, though she didn't feel reassured. The weight of being looked at like that was something she couldn't shake off easily. Finally, they reached the boarding house, a two-story building on the edge of the main street. The windows glowed warmly, and the faint scent of cooking food drifted out when the cowboy opened the door. Mariah hesitated before stepping inside, the warmth of the place almost overwhelming after the cold outside. "Welcome," the cowboy said, his tone softer now as he stepped aside to let her in. "Martha's got a good fire going. She'll take care of you." Inside, the boarding house was small but cozy. A few tables were scattered around the main room, each occupied by a lone person or a pair of quiet conversations. The warmth hit Mariah like a wave, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her cheeks, red from the cold, began to thaw as she looked around. It wasn't much, but it was a place where she could breathe, a place that could maybe offer the safety she'd been searching for. A woman who looked to be in her 60s stood near the stove, stirring a pot of stew. Her silver hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her hands moved with the practiced ease of someone who had done this for years. She looked up when they entered, her sharp blue eyes scanning Mariah with the same kind of scrutiny she had received from the townsfolk earlier. But instead of judgment, the woman smiled gently, her face softening. "Well now," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, "I didn't expect company so late. You must be Miss Calder." Mariah nodded, feeling suddenly small in the presence of this woman. "Yes, ma'am. I was hoping to find some work. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Her voice faltered, and she quickly looked down at the floor. Martha, the woman in front of her, chuckled softly. "You've done nothing of the sort. I can see you're in a tight spot, but you won't find trouble here. You'll find a meal, a roof over your head, and maybe some help figuring out what to do next." Mariah's throat tightened. She hadn't expected such kindness. She hadn't expected anything at all, let alone this warm welcome from a stranger. The cowboy, who had stepped back, spoke up again. "Martha, this is Mariah Calder. She's had a rough go of it, and I thought she could use a place to stay tonight." Martha looked between the two of them, her expression softening even further. "I see." She stepped closer, placing a hand on Mariah's arm. "We've all had our share of hard times, child. Come sit by the fire, and we'll get you settled in. Supper's just about ready." Mariah hesitated, but then allowed herself to be led to a small table near the stove. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth seeping into her chilled bones. She could feel the weight of exhaustion settle in her limbs, but a part of her was afraid to rest. Afraid that if she did, everything would fall apart. But as she sat down, the reality of what had happened slowly started to sink in. She had been rejected by Samuel, the man who had promised her a fresh start. She had sold everything to come here, and now she was here, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the twins who had somehow kept her going. Martha placed a steaming bowl of stew in front of her, and then sat down across from her. "You're safe here, Mariah. You've got no need to be afraid." Mariah's chest tightened as she looked at the woman. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done without someone offering help." Martha's gaze softened. "You'd have found a way, child. You seem like the type who doesn't give up easily." Before Mariah could respond, the cowboy moved to the door. "I'll head back to the clinic, Martha. I've got a few things to finish up tonight." He turned to Mariah and offered a small smile. "Rest up. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." Mariah watched him go, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. She didn't know what to make of the man. He had appeared out of nowhere, offering help when she had nowhere else to turn. And yet, Despite the kindness he had shown, she couldn't help but wonder what he wanted in return. But as the fire crackled, the stew warming her from the inside out, and the sound of Martha humming softly in the background, Mariah let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found a small flicker of hope. The next morning, Mariah awoke to the sound of wind howling outside the boarding house, rattling the windows like an angry beast. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the weariness that clung to her like a heavy blanket. The warmth of the bed and the fire downstairs were tempting, but she knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. Her mind raced with the thoughts of what had happened the day before. Samuel's cold rejection, his callous words echoing in her ears. She had traveled so far to be abandoned like that, to have her hopes dashed in front of strangers who didn't even offer a kind word. She had expected disappointment, but not like this. Not the complete and utter rejection that Samuel had shown her. As she slowly made her way downstairs, she found Martha in the kitchen, preparing another pot of stew. The woman's presence, steady and warm, was a balm to her bruised spirit. "Good morning," Martha said with a smile, looking up as Mariah entered. "I hope you slept well." Mariah nodded, though she felt anything but rested. "I did, thank you. It's just hard to shake off everything that happened." Martha's gaze softened with understanding. She set down the ladle and motioned for Mariah to take a seat at the small table. "I'm sure it is, but you're here now, safe, and you've got people who care. That counts for something." Mariah sank into the chair, grateful for the woman's kindness. She still couldn't quite wrap her head around the fact that someone was offering her help without asking for anything in return. It was a strange feeling, one that both comforted and unsettled her. She had been alone for so long, had learned to rely only on herself. But now, as the world around her seemed to be falling apart, she was realizing just how much she needed someone. Martha continued, her voice gentle. "I know you've had a rough time of it, but you're not alone here. We'll figure something out. You're capable, Mariah. You've got skills. We'll put them to good use." Mariah met her eyes, feeling a flicker of hope ignite in her chest. "I don't know what I can do. Samuel's letter promised so much, but now I've got nothing." Martha set a cup of coffee in front of her. "What's that old saying? When one door closes, another opens. I'm not saying it'll be easy, but I can see that you're a fighter. And that's the kind of person Riverbend needs." Before Mariah could respond, the door to the boarding house opened, and the cowboy, the one who had brought her here, stepped in, brushing the snow off his coat. His eyes scanned the room, then landed on her. "Morning," he said, his voice steady as ever. "You doing all right?" Mariah nodded, unsure of how to answer. "I'm adjusting." He took a step closer, studying her for a moment before he spoke again. "I didn't get a chance to introduce myself properly yesterday. Name's Luke Callahan. I run the clinic here in town." Quote. She met his gaze, feeling a small flicker of something like recognition in the way he looked at her. He wasn't just offering help. He seemed to expect her to take it. He wasn't offering charity. He was offering partnership. Luke glanced over at Martha, then back at Mariah. "I know you've had a rough start here, but there's work to be done in this town. People need help, and there's plenty of it to go around. Maybe you'd be interested in working with me. I'm short on staff, and I could use someone who's got the drive to help." Mariah blinked, caught off guard. "Work? But I have no experience in medicine. I'm not qualified." Luke smiled, though it wasn't the easy, carefree smile of a man used to offering comfort. It was a smile that came from someone who had seen more than his fair share of hardship and understood what it meant to survive in a harsh world. "You don't need to be a doctor to help, Mariah," he said. "I've been doing this long enough to know that it's not about having a degree or fancy letters next to your name. It's about caring for people, being willing to learn, and doing what's needed when it's needed. That's the kind of help I need." Mariah hesitated, her mind racing. This man, Luke, was offering her work, something she hadn't expected to find in this desolate place. But she had no medical training. No knowledge of medicine beyond the basics she had learned while caring for her own family back home. What could she possibly offer? Before she could voice her doubts, Luke continued, "I'm not looking for someone who's perfect. I'm looking for someone who's willing to roll up their sleeves and get things done. It's not going to be glamorous, but it's honest work, and people in this town need it." Martha watched the exchange with quiet interest. and Mariah could feel her heart pounding in her chest. This was more than just an offer. It was a lifeline. But could she take it? Could she step into a new life, into a new role, without knowing if she was truly capable? Luke seemed to sense her uncertainty. You don't have to decide right now. Just think about it. But the truth is, I could use someone like you. If you're willing to take a chance, I'll teach you what you need to know. And you'll have a place here with people who will back you up. Mariah felt the weight of the decision settle into her bones. She had come to Riverbend expecting safety. Instead, she had found rejection. But in front of her now was something more, a chance to rebuild, to stand on her own 2 feet, to do something real. Her hand shook slightly as she reached for the cup of coffee. I'll think about it, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. But inside, she knew the answer already. She was ready to take a chance. Mariah spent the next few days in a haze of exhaustion and indecision. Every time she tried to focus, her thoughts spiraled back to the rejection she had suffered in the town square. Samuel Holt's harsh words still echoed in her mind, his dismissal of her and her children like a slap that refused to fade. She couldn't help but wonder if she was destined for nothing but failure, moving from one dead end to the next. But then there was Luke. His steady presence, his quiet faith in her, had stirred something inside of her, something she hadn't felt in months. A spark of hope, small but real, that maybe there was a way out of the despair that had settled over her. The clinic he ran wasn't large by any means, but it had a certain charm. The walls were lined with shelves filled with glass bottles, small jars of herbs and medicine, and old leather-bound books that had seen better days. The air always smelled faintly of antiseptic and something earthy, a mixture of salves and remedies. Luke had taken the time to show her around, explaining what each section of the clinic was for and where the most needed supplies were kept. He made it clear that while there was much for her to learn, there was also a real place for her in his work. The town, though, still felt cold to her. She could feel the eyes of the residents on her as she walked through the streets, their silent judgment like a weight pressing on her chest. Riverbend had its gossip, and Mariah was the latest target. It was hard to escape the feeling that everyone was watching her, waiting for her to fail, to fall apart in front of them. But as the days passed, something unexpected happened. People began to warm to her, if only a little. When she stopped by the local bakery to ask for a loaf of bread, the woman behind the counter, a middle-aged woman with a sharp nose and quick eyes, didn't look at her with disdain like others did. Instead, she offered a curt but kind smile. "You're working with Dr. Callahan, I hear," she said as she wrapped the loaf in paper. "He's a good man. Tough, but he knows his stuff." Mariah nodded, surprised by the words. "He's been kind to me. He's offered me work." The woman's lips twitched. "He doesn't do that for just anyone, you know. He's got a heart, despite what people say about him. I think you'll do all right here." Mariah didn't know what to say. She took the bread and left, her heart a little lighter than before. As the days turned into a week, Luke continued to guide her through the tasks at the clinic. He started with the basics: how to sterilize medical tools, how to properly dress wounds, and how to keep patient records organized. There was so much to learn, but he was patient, explaining things again and again without ever making her feel inadequate. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And for the first time since she had arrived in Riverbend, Mariah began to feel like she had a purpose again. The work at the clinic, though hard and demanding, gave her a sense of stability, a feeling that maybe she could stand tall here after all. One afternoon, as she was organizing the shelves in the back room, Luke came in with a patient, a young man who had been out hunting and had managed to get himself scratched up in the process. His arm was bloodied and bruised from a run-in with some brush, but nothing too serious. Luke took charge of the situation immediately. "Set him down on the table, Mariah. Let's clean him up." She did as instructed, watching Luke's hands move with calm precision as he worked. His voice was steady, reassuring the young man as he worked. "You're lucky it's not deeper, son. We'll get you patched up quick." Mariah watched, fascinated by the way Luke worked. There was no hesitation in his movements, no uncertainty. He was confident, in control, and it made her realize just how much she still had to learn. But it didn't feel daunting anymore. It felt like something to strive for, something to build. As Luke finished stitching up the young man's arm, he turned to Mariah with a nod. "Good work today. You're learning fast." Mariah smiled, the praise lifting her spirits. "Thank you. I'm just glad to be here." "To be useful." Luke studied her for a moment, then nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're more than useful, Mariah. You're proving yourself every day. That's all anyone can ask for." The words settled deep in her chest, a balm to her bruised soul. She had spent so much of her life feeling like she was always just one step away from falling, from losing everything. But here, in this small clinic in a town that seemed to have forgotten her, she was finding something more, something that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. Later that evening, after the clinic had quieted down and the last patient had been sent on their way, Luke stood at the door, looking out at the darkening sky. "I've got a long night ahead of me. I've got rounds to make in the morning. You should get some rest." Mariah, who had been sitting quietly at the desk, sorting through the last of the day's paperwork, hesitated. She had gotten used to the stillness of the clinic, the way the world seemed to slow down when they were alone. There was something comforting about it, about him. "Are you sure you don't need help with those rounds?" she asked, not entirely sure why she had spoken. Luke turned, his gaze meeting hers. "I'm sure. But you're welcome to join me when you're ready. There's always more to do." She smiled, feeling the warmth of his offer in her chest. "I think I'll take you up on that eventually." Quote. He nodded, stepping out into the cold night, leaving Mariah to her thoughts. She had a long road ahead of her, but for the first time since stepping off that freight wagon, she didn't feel quite so alone. The days in Riverbend were long, but they were becoming familiar, and with each passing day, the world around Mariah felt a little less cold. She was starting to carve out a space for herself here, a place where she could stand tall, where her worth wasn't determined by a letter or a promise that had been broken. As the fire crackled in the clinic and the sound of the wind howled outside, Mariah looked toward the future. It wasn't clear. It wasn't perfect. But for the first time, it felt possible. The weeks that followed were filled with a mixture of challenges and quiet victories. Each day, Mariah grew a little more comfortable in the clinic, and with each task her confidence grew. Luke's patience and steady presence made it easier to settle into the rhythm of the work. She learned to take patient histories, clean wounds, and organize the clinic's cluttered supply room. The more she immersed herself in the work, the more she realized that the world she had stepped into was far different than the one she had left behind. Riverbend was still full of whispers. Samuel Holt's rejection had cast a long shadow, and it seemed that no matter how much time passed, there were always reminders of the humiliation she had endured. But slowly, the people who mattered, the ones who had seen her help, who had witnessed the way she worked and cared for the town, began to come forward, offering their support in small ways. One evening, after a particularly busy day in the clinic, Mariah was preparing to leave when the door opened, and a woman walked in with a bundle in her arms. The baby inside the blanket was tiny, barely more than a few days old, and its face was pinched with the unmistakable signs of a fever. The woman, her face lined with exhaustion, stepped forward and looked at Mariah with a mixture of hope and desperation. "Please, can you help him?" "My son, I can't. He's burning up." Mariah took a deep breath and motioned for the woman to sit. "I'll take care of him. Let me just get Luke." But before she could call for him, the door opened and Luke appeared, his face tight with concern. He had been out on rounds, but the urgency in the woman's voice had brought him back quickly. His eyes flicked to Mariah and then to the infant in the woman's arms. "Let's get him settled, then," Luke said in his usual calm tone, but there was no mistaking the urgency in his movements. He quickly washed his hands, and Mariah moved to assist him, taking the baby gently from the woman's arms. She felt the warmth of the infant's fever against her hands and instinctively held him closer. The next few hours were a blur of action. Luke worked with the precision of someone who had seen it all before, guiding Mariah as they tried to lower the baby's fever. The room was thick with the smell of herbs and medicine, and Mariah's heart pounded in her chest as she watched Luke work. "His fever's not breaking," Luke said after a while, his brow furrowed with worry. "We need to get more cold compresses on him." Mariah didn't hesitate. She moved quickly, soaking cloths and pressing them to the baby's hot forehead, the back of his neck, and his tiny chest. All the while, Luke monitored the child's breathing and temperature, giving directions, making quick decisions with a calm that Mariah admired more than she could put into words. After what felt like an eternity, the baby's fever finally began to break, and his breathing evened out. Luke sighed in relief, and Mariah let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. The woman, her face streaked with tears of both fear and gratitude, sank into the chair beside them. "Thank you," she whispered. "I thought I was going to lose him." Mariah smiled softly and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "It's what we're here for. He's strong, just a little weak right now, but he'll be okay." Luke looked over at Mariah, his eyes filled with approval. "You did well," he said quietly, his voice a little more than a whisper. It was a compliment that meant more than the others he had given her, the ones that simply praised her work. This one felt like something deeper, more personal. For a moment, Mariah didn't know how to respond. She had gotten used to Luke's quiet manner, his way of showing approval without a lot of words. But there was something about this praise that made her feel like she was part of something real, part of something that mattered. The woman stood, cradling her baby with newfound relief. "I don't know how to thank you both," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll never forget what you've done." "You don't need to thank us," Luke replied, his tone firm but kind. "Just take care of your son." As the woman left, Mariah stood by the door, watching her walk down the street, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. It had been one small victory in the grand scheme of things, but it felt significant. She had saved a life, and for the first time since she had arrived in Riverbend, she realized that this was what she had been looking for. Purpose. This was the kind of work that made everything else fade into the background. The gossips, the rejection, the fear of failure, they all seemed small now compared to the life she had just helped save. Luke stood beside her, watching the woman disappear into the distance. He didn't say anything for a long moment, but when he did, his voice was low and steady. "You did good tonight," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "You've got a gift for this, Mariah." She looked at him, feeling something warm stir in her chest. It wasn't just the praise, it was the way he said it. Like he believed in her, like he had always known she could do this. "Thank you," she replied softly. "I couldn't have done it without you." Luke gave her a small nod, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "We make a good team." Mariah didn't say anything more. She simply nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle into her heart. This was just the beginning, she knew. There would be more challenges, more hard days ahead. But for the first time in a long time, Mariah felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. And as the evening fell quiet around them, she realized that she was no longer just surviving in Riverbend. She was becoming part of it. The following weeks were a blur of new experiences and growing connections. Mariah found herself increasingly immersed in the clinic's work, and Luke's continued support made every challenge feel manageable. She was no longer just an outsider, struggling to fit into a place she didn't understand. She was part of something that felt bigger than herself, something that gave her purpose, a reason to wake up each day with hope. Riverbend, despite its initial coldness, had begun to soften around her. People who had once turned away from her now offered nods of recognition, even small gestures of kindness. The man who owned the local feed store called out to her one afternoon, offering a discount on the oats she needed to buy for her horses. A few of the women who had once looked at her with pity now greeted her with something like respect. But the biggest shift came when Luke, ever patient and ever quiet, began to open up more. He was always reserved, his emotions hidden beneath a calm, controlled exterior. But there were moments, small moments, that made Mariah see the person behind the doctor. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at the clinic, they found themselves alone in the small break room, the fire crackling in the corner as they finished a late supper. Mariah was wiping down the table, the weariness in her bones evident, when Luke set down his plate and looked at her. "You've changed things here," he said, his voice quiet but steady. Mariah paused, glancing up from her task. "I'm just trying to do my part." "No, it's more than that." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity she hadn't expected. "You've made this place better. Not just the work we're doing, but the way people look at the clinic. The way they look at me. You've brought something here that wasn't here before." Mariah felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected praise. She wasn't used to this, used to being praised for something that didn't feel like a small, quiet act of survival. It made her uncomfortable, but also something else. Something that made her feel proud in a way that nothing else had. "I don't know about that," she replied softly, her hand stilling on the rag. "I just wanted to make a difference." "You already have," Luke said simply. She met his eyes for a long moment, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. It was the kind of look that made her heart flutter, though she quickly tried to hide it behind a smile. "Well, I suppose we make a good team," she said, trying to keep things light, but her voice betraying the softness that had crept into her chest. Luke smiled back, a quiet, genuine thing that reached his eyes. "A damn good team." The next few days brought a sudden change to Riverbend, one that neither of them had anticipated. A large group of travelers passed through the town on their way to the mining camp up north, and among them was a man from the local council, someone who had been a member of the group that had questioned Mariah's place in the town. It wasn't a big deal at first, just another group passing through, stopping for supplies. But when the councilman's name was mentioned, Luke's expression darkened. Mariah noticed it, though she didn't comment, not wanting to bring up old wounds. When the man arrived at the clinic that afternoon, Mariah recognized him immediately. He was taller than most, with a sharp suit and a well-groomed mustache that seemed far too neat for a frontier town. He looked down at Mariah as though she were the dirt beneath his boots, his lips curled into a barely there sneer. "Dr. Breyer," he began, addressing Luke but never making eye contact with Mariah. "I hear you've been employing this woman, a woman with children, who is not even trained in the medical arts." Luke stood with a calm that seemed to steady the entire room, his eyes narrowed but his voice unwavering. "I'm aware of your concerns, Councilman Graves," Luke replied, "but I assure you Mrs. Calder has proven herself capable and essential to this practice. If you're here to question her qualifications, I suggest you take it up with the patients who depend on her. Otherwise, we have nothing to discuss." Graves scoffed. "You'll regret hiring someone with such questionable moral character." "People are talking." Luke stepped forward, his presence towering over the man. "Let them talk. It doesn't change the facts. People are getting better, and that's all that matters." Mariah stood in the background, listening to the exchange, her stomach tightening at the way Graves spoke of her. The man hadn't changed, still the same as when he'd humiliated her in the town square. But now, she felt different, stronger, as though her worth wasn't determined by the words of men like him. "Mr. Graves, with all due respect," Mariah spoke, her voice steady. "I'm here because Dr. Breyer saw something in me. I've proven myself, and I'll continue to do so." "Your opinion doesn't change that." Graves's eyes flicked to her, a sneer twisting his lips. He didn't answer her. He simply turned on his heel and walked out of the clinic, muttering something under his breath. Luke looked at Mariah, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he gave a small nod. "You handled that well," he said quietly. Mariah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I didn't know if I could, but I had to. This is my life now. I won't let anyone take it from me." Luke studied her for a moment, and then, as though he couldn't hold it in any longer, he stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm proud of you." Mariah's heart skipped a beat, and she looked up at him, not sure how to respond. The words he'd said earlier, the quiet, steady approval, seemed to echo in her mind. There was something there, something more than just professional respect. And it made her pulse quicken. They stood like that for a moment longer, the weight of the moment between them, before Luke finally pulled his hand away and cleared his throat. "We've got more work to do," he said, a little gruffly. Mariah nodded, but the heat of his hand still lingered on her shoulder. She had come to Riverbend thinking she was simply trying to survive. But in the quiet moments, when the world was still and Luke's presence felt like home, she realized that she had found something she wasn't sure she had even been looking for. Hope, respect, a purpose she had never thought possible, and, somewhere deep inside, the stirrings of something more. Something that went beyond the clinic, beyond the town square, beyond the gossip. Together they would continue to build this place, this life, one step at a time. And as they worked together, the future, whatever it held, no longer seemed so uncertain.